From a carving confirming the existence of King David to a stone inscribed by Pontius Pilate himself, here are the most astonishing archaeological discoveries that confirm biblical accounts. While skeptics might not think of the Bible as a factual document, historians can't deny this proof. For example, the Tel Dan inscription appears to confirm the existence of King David. The Tel Dan archaeological site is a pretty big deal because it was an important outpost in the Kingdom of Israel. Back in 1993, an archaeologist by the name of Gila Cook found building stones for a wall that contained a really interesting inscription. Basically, the ancient writing contained the letters BYTDWD. That's not just a random jumble of letters. It's actually a reference to the House of David, or, in other words, the lineage of King David himself. Carbon dating puts the inscription's origins around the 9th century BC, which makes it nearly 3,000 years old. There's also a layer of ash on the stone dated back to the Assyrian Wars that occurred around 723 BC, which proves the stones date beyond a reasonable doubt. These same letters were found on nearby Moabite rock, so this theory isn't just a shot in the dark. Some researchers have tried to disprove the letters as pure coincidence, but at some point you have to acknowledge that there's a pattern here. King David is sometimes seen by skeptics as a mythical figure, but finds like these show that he was a real person in ancient history. And that's not the only archaeological discovery that points to a historical David. There's also the stepped stone structure near Jerusalem, which might have been a part of King David's sprawling palace. Calling Jerusalem an old city is a massive understatement, because it might just be one of the most ancient urban settlements that are still inhabited to this day. Back when King David and his son Solomon were running the show, Jerusalem was a magnificent city that was the envy of all nearby nations. Unfortunately, it can be pretty hard to chart this city's history because the local government rarely hands out licenses for archaeological digs. Despite that, researchers have been hard at work trying to find evidence of what this city was like thousands of years ago, and they eventually came across a miraculous find just to the east of Mount Zion. You see, there's a stepped stone structure here that's most likely the last remnant of King David's palace. The challenges of getting a digging license meant that only 6 excavations have been conducted here in the past century, but archaeologists have managed to find some shocking evidence of its origins. A team of researchers from Bar Ilan University, led by Professor Avraham Faust, found a series of interlocking walls on top of a massive stone foundation that point to the structure being the crumbling remains of a castle. The building's shape indicates that it was built during the 10th century BC, since that's when this architectural style became popular in the Kingdom of Israel. That date strongly suggests that the castle existed during the time of King David. Of course, a lot more research is required before anything conclusive can be said. Until then, there are plenty of other archaeological finds that we should talk about. Perhaps the most important story in the Bible is the tale of the Exodus. The Israelites fled their oppression under the Egyptian pharaoh and made for the lands of Israel. And it turns out that there's some evidence of this massive migration buried under the Egyptian sands. The Merneptah stele is particularly interesting because it contains the oldest reference to the Israelites in the written record. If you ever want to see it for yourself, just head on over to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. They've got this ancient stone slab on display, and it might just be one of the most amazing things you've ever witnessed. So, in a nutshell, this unassuming rock has some unique carvings on it, and according to the experts, they're talking about the lands of Israel. To be more specific, the slab is talking about the pharaoh Merneptah and his great victory in the lands to the east, and there's a reference to the Israelites being defeated in battle. On top of that, the slab is dated to around 3,200 years ago, so the timing lines up. The fact that the Israelites are mentioned in this ancient written record proves that they were a real cultural group and that the Egyptians were aware of their existence. This also backs up other evidence pointing to their existence, so we can safely say that the Israelites and their exodus weren't just a work of fiction that was included in the Bible. It was a real event involving real people. Otherwise, the Egyptians never would have referenced them. We've only scratched the surface of biblical archaeology so far. Another major find was the Cyrus Cylinder, which proved the existence of another important figure that played a role in the history of the Israelites. Cyrus the Great is mentioned in the Old Testament, mostly because he helped the Israelites break free from captivity in the Kingdom of Babylon. The Cyrus Cylinder was discovered all the way back in 1879, and it corroborates that a king named Cyrus did, in fact, help the Israelites return to their sacred homeland. You can read all about this tale in the book of Ezra, and biblical scholars have said that the cylinder is irrefutable proof of what happened. Archaeologists do not all agree with this viewpoint, however. Some argue that the Jews aren't specifically mentioned on the clay cylinder, which just goes to show how difficult it is to establish consensus in any field of research. But at the same time, the cylinder does prove that Cyrus was a very progressive and tolerant ruler. On top of that, it's dated to around 600 BC, and its discovery at the ancient site of Babylon seems to line up with what we already know from the Bible. However, there will always be critics who argue against these notions. Many secular scholars don't like the idea of associating archaeological finds with the Bible. Can we really be sure that it hasn't been changed over the course of its history? Well, you'd be surprised at how intact it is. Just take a look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and you'll see what we mean. These tattered pieces of parchment and papyrus were discovered in the Qumran caves along the Dead Sea's northern shore, and they've been dated to the Second Temple period. This was a 600-year stretch during which the Second Temple existed within Jerusalem's borders, and these scrolls were all composed during this time. They're the oldest existing copies of the Old Testament ever discovered, but they also include manuscripts that scholars had never even heard of. The most important thing to note here is that the scrolls are extremely similar to the Bible you might read today. This proves that this religious text hasn't changed at all, even though you might expect some major deviations across thousands of years. When they were first discovered in 1947, the entire field of biblical scholarship was shaken to its very core. All of a sudden, people could read the Old Testament as it was written before the birth of Christ, and scholars have still only scratched the surface of the thousands of scraps that comprise it. Okay, so far we've mostly covered archaeological finds that reference the Old Testament in some way. But what about discoveries pertaining to Jesus Christ? Archaeologists have made quite a bit of progress on that front as well, such as the discovery of the Siloam Pool. If you've ever read the Gospel of John, you'd know all about Jesus' miraculous healing of a blind man. This event occurred at the Pool of Siloam, but no one really knew where it was for most of history. In 2004, the mystery was finally solved in the most unlikely way imaginable. A group of workers were doing some excavation to install a sewage line when they came across a peculiar series of stone steps. You can probably guess how excited archaeologists get when they come across stone steps, and sure enough, a couple of researchers working for the Israel Antiquities Authority started to study the find. On August 9, 2005, they officially confirmed that they'd uncovered the Pool of Siloam, proving the site where Jesus restored sight to the blind is real. This isn't the only discovery that confirms Jesus' story either. We all know about Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect who ordered Jesus' crucifixion. In 1961, archaeologists found the Pilate Stone, which contains text written by the man himself. Sure, there are some inscriptions that reference him from ancient historians, but none of them were written during his lifetime, let alone by his own hand. This chunk of limestone is the earliest evidence ever found that verified Pontius Pilate's status as a Roman governor, as well as the fact that he was around during Jesus' time. The text itself is nothing special. It's just a tribute dedicated to Emperor Augustus, but it clearly comes from Pontius Pilate, which is why it's such a historical find. Who knows what other amazing discoveries archaeologists will make next? So from the Pilate Stone to the Tel Dan inscription, these were just a few of the archaeological discoveries that confirmed biblical accounts.